The night was colder than it had any right to be. The kind of cold that seeps into the bones, sharp and unforgiving, even though the calendar still swore it was autumn. Walter Keene stood on the porch of his own house, fists pounding against the heavy oak door until his knuckles burned red. His breath came out in quick, jagged clouds, each one dissolving into the wind like smoke. "Nora! Open the door!" His voice cracked, not from weakness but from fury, and maybe a little disbelief. "You can't do this to me." From inside, muffled laughter spilled out, soft at first, then rising until it felt like nails against his skin. His daughter. His only daughter. He could picture her standing just beyond the peephole, arms crossed, smirking in that way she used to when she got away with sneaking cookies before dinner. Except tonight, it wasn't mischief. It was malice. The peephole darkened, and he felt her eyes on him. "Please, Nora," he said again, lowering his tone, almost pleading. The weight of his 69 years pressed on him all at once. His joints ached, his chest was tight, and the chill had already turned his fingers stiff. "It's too cold. I don't have my phone. At least give me my keys." A shadow shifted on the other side. A lock clicked, but not the one he prayed for. Instead, she slid the chain tighter, ensuring the door stayed sealed. Then her voice, laced with mockery, cut through. "You always said I should learn responsibility, Dad," she said. "Consider this, me teaching you. Think of it as a lesson." Walter froze. For a moment, he thought he misheard. But the smugness in her tone cut deep. He pressed his forehead against the door. "Nora, don't play games." "My chest," he winced, hand pressing against his ribcage. A dull ache pulsed there, the kind that could easily spiral into something worse. "At least let me in until morning. I'll sign whatever you want." Silence. Then another laugh, lighter this time, crueler. He could hear footsteps padding away, then the sudden click of the hallway light switch. Through the front window, the glow vanished. She'd left him in darkness. Walter staggered back a step, his shoulder hitting the porch column. The cold bit harder without the distraction of shouting. The sky above was ink black, littered with faint stars blurred by thin clouds. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Most homes were dark, curtains drawn. Nobody around to see him shivering on his own doorstep. His keys. She had them. He'd left them on the kitchen counter earlier, right next to his reading glasses. She'd picked them up, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll take care of these." He thought it was one of those small kindnesses, her way of helping. Now, standing in the icy dark, he realized it had been part of the plan all along. He tried the windows, first the living room, then the study. Locked, every one of them. He went around to the back, shoes crunching on frosted leaves, the security light clicking on. His shadow stretched across the lawn like a ghost, mocking his every move. The back door was worse, the deadbolt firmly in place, the curtains drawn tight. Walter leaned against the siding, panting. His mind flickered back to earlier that evening, before everything turned sour. He remembered sitting in his recliner, glasses perched on his nose, reading the paper. Nora had walked in, hair pulled back, phone in hand, asking if he'd thought more about putting the house in her name just in case something happened. He'd brushed it off, telling her he wasn't dead yet, and the will already spelled things out. Her lips had tightened, but she'd smiled anyway, that tight smile she always used when she was swallowing anger. Now he understood. Tonight wasn't about teaching him anything. It was about power. Control. And maybe something darker. A gust of wind whipped across the porch, and he coughed hard, knees buckling for a second. He caught himself on the railing, vision swimming. "Breathe," he muttered, forcing air into his lungs. "Don't let her win." But even as he tried to steady himself, a sick thought slithered into his head. What if this was what she wanted? To watch him weaken. To see him suffer. Maybe even worse. She knew about his heart. She'd seen him collapse 2 winters ago, gasping until the paramedics arrived. And now she had taken his phone, his keys, his warmth. Walter's gaze flicked to the upstairs window. A light glowed faintly behind the curtain. He could picture Nora inside, curled in his favorite chair, sipping wine, laughing with Caleb, her husband, the one who always lingered too close to his safe, too curious about his accounts. He felt a swell of betrayal so deep it threatened to choke him. This was his blood. His daughter. The girl he'd carried on his shoulders at the county fair, the one he'd read bedtime stories to, the one he'd stayed up nights for when she was sick. And now she had locked him outside his own home like he was nothing. He sank onto the porch step, head in his hands, the cold boards pressing through his slacks. The night stretched out before him like a punishment with no end. He could already feel the ache spreading from his chest to his arm. Fear clawed at him, but under it, beneath the trembling, something else stirred. It wasn't just despair. It was anger. Not wild, reckless anger, but something quieter. Sharper. Like a blade pressed against stone, waiting to be honed. His eyes moved to the far corner of the house, half hidden behind the shadow of the hydrangeas. The crawlspace door. Rusted, nearly forgotten, but not gone. His heart kicked harder. She thought she had locked him out. She thought she had control. Walter pulled himself up, legs shaky but mind suddenly clear. He staggered off the porch, into the yard, his breath burning in his throat. The wind hissed through the branches, almost like it was urging him forward. When he crouched before the crawlspace hatch, he laid his trembling hand on the handle. Cold metal kissed his palm. He hesitated just once, looking back at the porch where he had begged like a fool. Then he whispered, "Your lesson, Nora, is about to backfire." And with a sharp tug, he pulled the hatch open. The hatch gave with a rasp that sounded too loud in the sleeping street. Walter lowered himself into the rectangle of black, boots sliding on cold dirt. The air under the house was damp and old, like wet stone and sawdust. He lay on his stomach and pushed forward, elbows and knees, the crawlspace pinching his shoulders as cobwebs brushed his cheeks. Gravel pressed into his ribs. Every inch felt like a test of stubbornness. Above him the house sighed, ducks ticking, a pipe settling. He froze at a faint sound, the small, bright clink of glass on glass. Laughter, 2 notes, then a whisper blurred by floorboards. He shut his eyes and pictured the living room directly overhead, the lamp with the frayed pole chain, the corner where his late wife had kept her quilting basket. Now a different life sat there, feet on his ottoman. He angled left where he knew the joists widened. He had built this place 38 years ago, when his hands were steadier and his back didn't complain at every twist. He knew the underbelly like a map, sump pump pit to the north wall, HVAC trunk center, the little framed opening he'd added after a spring flood to reach a shut-off valve. He had told no one about the panel. It was the kind of precaution an old carpenter makes and then forgets until a night like this. His palm found the cutout, plywood painted the same dull gray as the foundation. He felt along the edges for the screws, found the slots deadened with dust, and dug a coin from his pocket with numb fingers. The nickel squealed as he turned each screw half, then full, then free, the heads dropping into his palm. He eased the panel away, breath held, and set it on the dirt. Cool concrete kissed his knuckles as he reached through into the basement void. There, his fingertips brushed a dangling pull cord. He wrapped it around 2 fingers and tugged. A single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a cone of yellow on the workbench he had built of pine and habit. The little room beyond smelled of oil and cedar shavings and winters spent fixing things no one else would. Walter wriggled through the opening and dropped the last foot with a grunt, catching himself on the wooden brace of the bench. Pain sparked up his wrist and faded. He stood still, letting his breathing level out, listening for an answering sound from upstairs. None came, only the muffled whir of the refrigerator and the faint hum of the thermostat. He flipped the second pull chain over the main bench. Tools lay where he'd left them, chisels and a coffee can, a rasp with a thumb-worn handle, a jar of mismatched screws. The vise at the corner still held a square of walnut he'd meant to shape into a picture frame for a photograph he could never bring himself to hang. On the far wall, shelves lined with paint tins and old fuse boxes glowed dusty gold. He looked down at himself, mud streaking his sleeves, grit embedded in the lines of his palms. He flexed his hands, they trembled slightly. He crossed to a cabinet and opened it. An old army blanket lay folded on the top shelf, the wool familiar and scratchy. He draped it over his shoulders and the first layer of cold peeled away. From the basement stairs, a vertical slice of darkness rose toward the kitchen door. He knew the top would be locked. He had installed that deadbolt himself after a rash of break-ins on the block 15 years ago. But he also knew something else. He'd been a man who planned for bad nights before he ever expected them. Under the bench lip, fixed with a strip of old duct tape, his fingertips found metal. He peeled the tape back. A flat brass key slid into his palm, labeled in his neat block letters with a word only he would remember: pantry. Before he upgraded the kitchen, the pantry had had a swinging door. When he'd replaced it with a proper threshold, he'd kept the old latch hardware and a keyed cylinder in the basement door for continuity. He smiled without humor. Continuity had just become salvation. He pocketed the key and moved to the foot of the stairs. He stood there a long time, head tilted, listening for the rhythm of footsteps, the pattern of voices that tells you where people are even when you can't see them. Upstairs, a faint pop of a cork. Caleb's voice, smooth and pleased, drifted down through the gaps. Told you, cold will do the persuading. Tomorrow he'll sign, one way or another. Nora's reply was lower, uncertain, as if she were stepping carefully on stones midstream. He hates pressure. If he gets stubborn. He won't, Caleb murmured. A whisper-close sound, his mouth near her ear. People break when you take away comfort. You said that yourself. The ice clattered in a glass. And if he doesn't sign, the notary comes, we make it formal. We're protecting him. That's the story. Walter pressed his tongue to his teeth until the pressure steadied him. The house was trying to vibrate the anger out of him. He made it settle instead. He lifted one foot to the first stair. The wood gave a quiet groan, and he waited until the heater kicked on to cover the next step. He ascended in the stuttering rhythm of the furnace. 1, fan work, 2, fan work, 3. At the top, his shoulder came level with the old basement door. He brought the flat key to the lock and eased it in, breath shallow. The tiniest scrape of brass on brass sounded loud as a bell in his own ears, but nothing changed overhead. He turned the key a hair at a time. The bolt slid with a felted click. He paused, hand on the knob, and let his heart beat quiet. Not yet. He backed down the stairs and returned to the bench. He needed warmth, clarity, a plan with corners you could set a picture frame on. He plugged in the little ceramic space heater he kept for winter projects and aimed it at his knees. The smell of dust burning off coils rose in a soft gray ribbon. He held his hands over it and watched the tremor settle. He picked at a splinter in his thumb and remembered teaching Nora how to sand with the grain when she was 8, her tongue stuck out at the corner of her mouth, sawdust freckles on her cheeks. Something like grief moved under his ribs, heavy as wet cloth. He let it pass and turned to what could be used. On the upper shelf, to the right of the paint tins, a row of innocuous white pucks sat in a plastic tray, extra smoke detectors he kept for rentals and for the habit of preparedness. He didn't look at them long, not yet. He made a different inventory instead: a functioning flashlight, spare batteries, the old transistor radio, duct tape, a clean shop towel, a small bottle of antiseptic he dabbed on the scrape along his forearm. He washed his hands in the utility sink, the water biting cold at first and then grudgingly warm. He scrubbed the dirt from under his nails with a stiff brush until his hands looked like a man's hands again. He clicked off the bench light and sat in the glow of the heater, listening. Above, Caleb's voice rolled onward, selling comfort in a tone that made comfort sound like a favor you'd be foolish to decline. Power of attorney is normal, Nora. Banks like it. He doesn't have to do anything after that. Papers rustled. A printer chirped and began to feed. We'll keep the originals with us. You know how he misplaces things. A quiet space. Then Nora, brittle, he said Moms will already. She didn't see what he's like now. Caleb's smile was audible. Tomorrow, we smile, we get ink. No drama. No bruises. Just signatures. Cutaway. In the living room, Nora stood by the window, wine glass cradled against her stomach like a shield. The porch lamp she had killed left the glass black, only her reflection looked back, thin and pale and younger than she felt. Caleb sprawled on the couch as if it were already his, one arm thrown over the top, the other balancing his phone. On the coffee table lay a neat stack of papers, corners aligned, a pen placed precisely parallel to the edge. On his screen, a message thread with a contact saved as Notary Tom flashed a thumbs up and a time, 9 a.m. Nora's eyes lingered on the door. For a moment, a furrow cut between her brows. "He's really out there," she whispered, like she was daring the words to become concern. Caleb clicked his tongue and turned up the TV volume 2 notches. The moment passed. Back in the basement, Walter shut his eyes and let the picture complete itself, the wine, the forms, the pen aligned just so. He felt the weight of the spare key in his pocket and the shape of his daughter's voice from when she was small, calling down the stairs, "Daddy, are you done yet? I'm cold." He had always gone up then. He would go up now, but not to be taught. He stood, folded the blanket over his arm, and switched off the heater. The room fell into the softer hum of the house at night. He climbed the stairs again, matching his footfalls to the furnace breath. At the top, he pressed his ear to the door and waited through a commercial, a sitcom laugh track, the slide of one glass being set gently down. He turned the key and worked the knob. The latch lifted. He opened the door just an inch, enough to feel the warmer air of the kitchen slip around his face. The smell of dish soap and lemon peel seeped through, achingly ordinary. He closed it again and relocked it from the inside, leaving the key where it would find the slot an instant later. Not yet. Dawn would give him cover, there's sleep, the heater, the gullible quiet of morning when people assume the world has behaved overnight. He patted back down, folded the blanket as neatly as a soldier, and sat on the bottom stair with his hands steepled under his chin. He let one truth settle in, heavy and clean: they thought the night had made him small. It had not. It had made him invisible. He waited, listening to the house he had built, a house that still knew his steps and kept its secrets for the one who had poured them into its walls. Outside, the wind veered. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Upstairs, the TV clicked off. Footsteps crossed the room, a door closed, a pipe sang for a moment as water ran, then quiet lengthened into sleep. Walter rose at last. He tested the stiffness in his knees and smiled to himself, a thin line tilted with purpose. "Tomorrow," he breathed, almost soundless, "we'll all learn something." Walter awoke to the sound of silence, the kind of silence that presses against the ears until it feels heavier than noise. The basement bulb still glowed faintly overhead, but the heater had gone cold. His body ached from the stair step where he drifted in and out of a shallow, restless doze. When he rubbed his eyes and looked at his watch, the hands pointed to 3:42 a.m. He stood slowly, joints crackling like dry branches. The house above him was asleep. No television hum, no clink of glasses, no muted conversation. Just stillness. He moved toward the bench, his mind clearing in layers. He knew the night hadn't only left him cold, it had left him with something else: knowledge. That overheard conversation about signatures, that cruel laugh at the door. But words without proof or air. Caleb was smart enough to twist her loyalty, and Nora was desperate enough to play along. They'd call him senile, confused, exaggerating. He'd need more than memory. His gaze drifted to the far shelf. A thin smile formed. They had forgotten. Walter reached up and slid down the plastic tray of spare smoke detectors. To anyone else they were hardware store leftovers. To him, they were his eyes, cheap cams he'd wired himself 2 years earlier after he noticed cash missing from his wallet. They looked like safety devices, each with a blinking diode and a neat battery door, but inside each was a tiny SD card. He had hidden them in plain sight, one above the pantry door, one in the living room, one over the front entry. He hadn't checked them in months. Now, the thought sent a shiver, not of cold, but anticipation, through his chest. On the bench sat a small viewing device he had rigged years ago, a pocket-sized LCD screen with a card slot. His hands trembled as he slid in the first card. The screen lit blue, then flickered into grainy footage. Clip 1, the living room, hours earlier. Walter himself sitting in his recliner, paper in hand. Nora walking in with her phone, Caleb following with that predatory ease of his. Walter felt the hairs rise on his arms as he watched himself brush off Nora's suggestion about the deed. He saw the faint tightening of her jaw when he said no, the sly nod Caleb gave her behind Walter's turned shoulder. They thought he hadn't noticed. The camera had. He swapped cards, heart pounding. Clip 2, the front entry, timestamped 9:07 p.m. Nora standing by the counter, lifting his keyring into her palm, slipping it into her pocket while Caleb blocked the doorway, talking loudly about wine. Walter's throat went dry. Proof. Clip 3, later, 11:14 p.m. The door shaking in its frame as Walter pounded outside. Nora's silhouette leaning against the wall, watching him through the peephole. Her lips curved in that smirk, visible even in the low light, and then she snapped the chain shut with deliberate care. The image froze in his head like a painting, her face half lit by the hall lamp, satisfaction carved into her smile. His daughter. His little girl. His hand gripped the bench vise until his knuckles whitened. He pulled the card out, slid it into an envelope from the shelf, and marked it with tonight's date. Then another. And another. Each card into its envelope, each envelope into a stack. It felt ritualistic, like laying bricks for a wall he knew would stand. Walter sat at the bench, staring at the footage still lingering on the LCD, replaying in his mind the moment Nora laughed. He pressed pause. Her image froze, mouth curved upward, the kind of smile that once meant pride on school recital nights, now curdled into cruelty. For a long moment, he couldn't breathe. "Why?" he whispered. No answer came, only the hum of the old fridge upstairs kicking on. He leaned back, ran a hand through his hair. He couldn't let grief swallow him now. Grief could come later. For now, proof was a weapon. He gathered the envelopes, tucked them inside a weatherproof pouch, and slid it beneath the old cedar chest by the wall. Safe. Then he turned back to the bench, eyes falling on another piece of equipment, a small audio recorder, square and black, no bigger than a wallet. He'd used it once to capture a contractor's promises. He tested the button, and a green LED blinked. Still functional. He smiled faintly. If cameras told one truth, voices would tell another. Walter pressed his palms on the table and took a long breath. Upstairs, the house creaked as if turning in its sleep. He shut the viewing device down and slid it into the drawer, covering it with rags. Then he lifted the audio recorder, slid it into the pocket of his cardigan, and whispered to the empty room. "You taught me my lesson. Now it's my turn." Meanwhile, upstairs in the dim bedroom, Nora stirred under the heavy quilt. A sliver of moonlight touched her cheek. She opened her eyes, heart skipping, certain she'd heard something. For a second, her mind conjured the porch, her father's fists beating against the door. She saw his face, pale and pleading. A sting of guilt pierced her chest. She turned her head. Caleb lay beside her, phone face down on the nightstand, breathing slow, arm draped over his side of the bed. She whispered, "What if he," but bit the words back. She tried to shake it away, telling herself the cold had humbled him. He'd be ready to sign by morning. Still, she couldn't erase the faint dread gnawing at the back of her mind, as if something in the house had shifted. Her eyes drifted shut again, but her breathing stayed shallow. Down in the basement, Walter sat against the stairs, arms crossed over the blanket. The crawlspace had given him entry. The cameras had given him proof. Now he had both a path and a weapon. He leaned his head back against the wood, eyes half closed, hearing the faint tick of pipes above. Every creak was a reminder. She thought he was locked outside, helpless. She thought she was in control. But he had been inside all along. And tomorrow, he would start to teach her what that meant. The first pale threads of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the frost-tipped grass in silver. Walter, seated at the basement stair with his blanket draped neatly over his lap, had not slept. The hours had passed in fragments, watching the tiny LCD glow with his daughter's betrayal, listening to the faint groans of his house settling, feeling the furnace hum like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. By the time the world outside shifted from black to bruised gray, he was ready. Upstairs, footsteps. A door clicked open. Caleb's voice, groggy but firm, "Go on. He'll be ready to crawl back in by now." Nora hesitated. Walter heard the shuffle of slippers against hardwood, then the soft scrape of the chain sliding back. The front door creaked open. Walter pictured the scene, his daughter, arms crossed against the chill, peering out to see her father collapsed in shame, ready to beg, ready to yield. That was the image she wanted, proof of her control. But the porch was empty. The morning wind slipped past her, tugging at the robe tied loosely around her waist. Her breath plumed white. The doormat lay untouched, not a trace of footprints in the dusting of frost. "Dad," she whispered, leaning halfway out. Her voice carried no humor now, only the thin edge of unease. Caleb appeared behind her, hair mussed, mug of coffee in hand. "Where is he?" He was right here," she stammered, glancing to the yard, then to the sidewalk. "He couldn't have gone far. He doesn't even have his coat." Caleb narrowed his eyes at the empty porch. His jaw flexed once. Maybe a neighbor took him in. Fine. All the better, he'll be embarrassed. By tonight he'll sign to avoid more scenes. But Nora didn't answer. Her eyes had caught something. Muddy footprints. They trailed across the wooden planks of the porch, faint but visible in the thin frost. They didn't lead away down the steps, nor toward the yard. They led inside. Her breath caught. "Caleb." He followed her gaze. The prints crossed the threshold, a path of faint smudges leading toward the kitchen. And on the table by the window, something impossible. A mug of coffee, steam curling into the cool air. Nora stepped inside slowly, her robe brushing the prints. "This wasn't here last night." Caleb's voice hardened. Then he must have slipped in when he stopped, noticing the small shift in her face. She wasn't looking at the mug anymore. She was staring at the stairs. Walter stood there, calm and collected, wearing a clean sweater and trousers. His gray hair was combed back, his face freshly washed, not a trace of the suffering she expected to see. He looked like a man who had slept soundly in his own bed, not one who had been cast into the cold. "Morning," he said evenly. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the room like iron beneath velvet. "Rough night?" Nora's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her mind scrambled for explanations. How? When? Why didn't he pound again? Why didn't he collapse on the porch? Caleb's eyes narrowed. He covered his unease with a sip of coffee. "You should have told us you came back in. You gave Nora quite a scare." Walter smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't. "Did I?" The silence after was suffocating. Nora felt her throat dry, her chest tightening. Something about her father's composure unnerved her. He wasn't angry, wasn't begging, wasn't defeated. He looked in control. She forced a laugh, brittle and unconvincing. "Dad, you should have knocked harder. We didn't hear you." Walter's eyes flicked toward the porch, then back to her. He didn't call her out. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he descended the last step slowly, each footfall deliberate, as though the house itself bent to his pace. He reached the table, lifted the steaming mug, and took a slow sip. Then he set it down with care, aligning it precisely with the grain of the wood. "Coffee's good," he said softly. "Always better in the morning." Nora's stomach twisted. It was the way he said it, not casual, not kind. It sounded like a line in a conversation she hadn't been invited to. Like he knew something she didn't. Caleb tried to recover, motioning vaguely at the papers stacked on the counter. "Why don't we get an early start? Just sign what we discussed, and this tension will be behind us." Walter turned his gaze on him. For a heartbeat, Caleb faltered. There was nothing weak in that stare. Not today, Walter said. I'm not fond of rushing. And with that, he pulled out a chair and sat, calm as a man entertaining guests. He folded his hands, fingers steady, while upstairs the early sun slipped through the curtains, catching the faint tremor in Nora's shoulders. The prints on the floor remained between them, a silent map that told a story she couldn't explain, a reminder that her father had been where he should not have been, seen what he should not have seen. She swallowed hard, the bitter taste of fear pooling in her throat. Because for the first time since the night began, she felt it clearly. Her father wasn't the one trapped. She was. The kitchen smelled of roasted beans and faint lemon, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains in narrow golden stripes. Walter sat at the head of the table, posture straight, the steam from his coffee curling past his face. His eyes were calm, too calm, and that unsettled Nora more than if he had shouted. She stood near the counter, arms folded tightly across her chest, robe cinched at the waist. She wanted to speak, to explain away the footprints on the floor, the steaming mug, the impossible fact that her father had spent the night inside when she had locked him out. But the words tangled in her throat, and every time she caught his eyes, she felt like a child again, caught sneaking candy, only this time the stakes were far darker. Caleb, ever the actor, forced a wide grin. He walked around the table, refilled his mug, and placed the coffee pot back with a click. See? Everyone's up early. Good energy for a new day. Walter tilted his head, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood. Tea, he said. Nora blinked. Tea? He nodded. Coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoon. Old habit. Haven't broken it yet. He crossed to the cabinet, pulled out a tin, and set it on the counter. His movements were precise, unhurried, as though he were in total command of the room. He filled the kettle at the sink, the hiss of running water breaking the silence. Then he turned slightly, eyes brushing past his daughter. Will you join me, Nora? Her mouth opened, then closed. She forced a nod. Of course, Dad. Walter smiled faintly, but his eyes held no warmth. He set the kettle on the stove, flame flaring beneath. Then, almost casually, he slid the sugar bowl to the center of the table, its porcelain lid rattling faintly. Inside the bowl, tucked beneath the sugar cubes, sat a tiny black square, no bigger than a matchbox. A recorder. Its LED light hidden, its microphone ready. Walter's hand lingered on the lid a moment too long before he withdrew, but neither Nora nor Caleb noticed. He poured water into the teapot, steam rising in gentle ribbons, and brought the set to the table. His hands were steady, each motion deliberate. He poured for himself first, then for Nora, then for Caleb. The cups clinked softly against their saucers. Walter raised his cup, inhaled the steam, and then looked at Nora. Let's not fight, he said quietly. We're family. We should drink together, talk together. Like we used to. Nora's fingers tightened on the handle of her cup. Yes, Dad. Like we used to. For a brief moment, she almost believed him. Almost let herself sink into the warmth of the tea, the familiarity of sitting at the table with her father. But when she looked into his eyes again, she saw it, the stillness, the calculation, the silence that spoke louder than any words. She set her cup down quickly. Excuse me, she muttered, rising from her chair. Walter's gaze followed her, but he said nothing. She stepped into the hallway where Caleb waited, leaning against the wall with arms crossed. His eyes narrowed. He's different this morning. He's calm, Nora whispered. Too calm. Last night, he was pounding on the door. Now it's like he knows something. Caleb snorted softly. Let him act. He'll break. Just keep steady. He pulled her closer, lowered his voice. Remember why we're doing this. He can't handle the estate anymore. We're protecting him and ourselves. You saw the balance sheets. Once it's in your name, it's safe. For both of us. Nora nodded slowly, but her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe this was for her father's good. But the look in Walter's eyes, the measured patience, gnawed at her. Back in the kitchen, Walter sipped his tea and let the recorder capture every word. When Nora and Caleb returned, Walter was still seated, cup resting neatly on its saucer. He looked up, his expression serene. "Feel better?" he asked. Nora forced a smile. "Yes, Dad." "Good," Walter said, leaning back slightly. "Then maybe we can talk properly tomorrow. No more arguments. We'll do it the right way. I'll even sign what you want, just not today. Tomorrow, with a notary. That way it's proper." Caleb's eyes flickered, calculating. He forced a nod. "Of course. That's reasonable." Walter smiled faintly, though the smile never reached his eyes. "Good. Then we're agreed." He rose, carried his cup to the sink, and rinsed it clean. His back was to them, but his ears caught the faint sigh of relief they shared, the quiet exchange of glances. He dried the cup, set it on the rack, and looked out the window at the yard. The morning light had grown stronger, birds darting between branches, the world outside so ordinary it almost mocked the storm brewing inside the house. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, and in that silence, his mind settled on one thought: they thought he was broken. But they were the ones trapped in a lie. He turned, leaned casually against the counter, and said, "I'll make dinner tonight. The three of us. Like a family." Nora blinked, startled. "Dinner?" "Yes. Stew. Simple, hearty. Something we can all share." He smiled again, but his eyes glittered cold. "You'll be here, won't you?" Caleb hesitated. "Of course." Walter nodded once. "Good. Then it's settled." He walked past them, slow and steady, climbing the stairs with the quiet confidence of a man who had already seen the ending written. Each step echoed like a warning in Nora's ears. She turned to Caleb, whispering, "Why do I feel like he's the one setting the terms?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "Because he's bluffing. That's all. By tomorrow, this will all be done." But Nora wasn't convinced. And deep inside, she knew her father's calm wasn't a bluff at all. It was something far more dangerous. The stew pot still lingered in the sink from lunch, its heavy lid balanced against the drying rack. Walter had cooked deliberately, simple potatoes, beef, carrots, enough to give the house the illusion of comfort. But beneath the savory scent, the tension only sharpened. He could feel it in the way Nora avoided his eyes, in the way Caleb kept glancing at the clock as though waiting for a cue. Afternoon light spilled across the kitchen table, illuminating a neat stack of papers Caleb had carried in under his arm. He had placed them there with ceremony, aligning the corners as though they were holy documents. Walter had noticed the leather portfolio he'd been so protective of. Now, Caleb sat across from Walter, a pen in his hand, the papers spread like a fan between them. His voice was casual, smooth, but the eagerness betrayed him. "Just some standard documents," Caleb said. "Power of attorney, nothing unusual. All perfectly legal. It's just to keep you safe, Walter. No more confusion with bills or property taxes." Walter didn't move. He let his eyes drift over the stack. He caught the headings in bold: Power of attorney. Title transfer request. Beneficiary amendment. He knew what they meant. He'd built companies, read contracts more complicated than this. He'd also watched Caleb enough to see the glimmer of greed behind his well-polished smile. Nora hovered near the counter, twisting her hands in the belt of her cardigan. Her face was pale, her lips tight. She said nothing. Walter leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" His voice was calm, but edged with something Nora couldn't quite name. Caleb chuckled lightly, leaning forward. "It's not about thinking of everything. It's about being prepared. These are just papers, Walter. Sign them, and you'll have less to worry about. You'll still live here, still enjoy the house. Nothing changes day to day. Walter tilted his head. Except the ownership. Except control. Caleb's smile flickered, then steadied. Technically, yes. But practically? You won't notice. It's protection. For you. For Nora. Walter let the words settle. He glanced at his daughter. She flinched, her eyes darting away. For a moment, he thought he saw guilt flicker across her face, quickly smothered by fear. He turned back to Caleb. You want me to sign today? Yes, Caleb said firmly, pushing the top page closer. The pen clicked as he twisted it in his fingers. The sooner it's official, the better. No hassle. No drama. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. He reached out, pinched the corner of the paper between his fingers, and lifted it. His gaze lingered on the lines, the fine print that transferred more than just rights, it transferred everything. Then he set it back down carefully, aligning it as neatly as Caleb had placed it. Not today. The silence was instant, sharp. Caleb blinked. What? Not today, Walter repeated evenly. We'll do it tomorrow. With a notary. That way it's proper. No rushing. Caleb's jaw tightened. He forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. Walter, there's no need for a notary. These papers are clear. My friend can witness if needed. We don't have to. Walter held up a hand. Tomorrow. With a notary. His tone was final. Nora stepped forward quickly, her voice trembling. Dad, Caleb's right, it doesn't have to be complicated. Walter turned his gaze on her, and she fell silent. His eyes weren't angry. They were steady, calm, but in them she saw something that made her throat close, certainty. Caleb leaned back, exhaling through his nose. His smile never reached his eyes. Fine. Tomorrow, then. We'll arrange it. Walter nodded, satisfied. He rose from the table, leaving the papers untouched. As he passed the doorway, his steps were steady, unhurried. But inside, his mind was racing. He had bought himself time. One day. Enough to prepare. Upstairs, Nora cornered Caleb in their room. This isn't working, she hissed. He's not breaking. He's different. It's like he knows something. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, pacing. He's bluffing. Old men get stubborn when they feel cornered. Tomorrow he'll have no choice. Nora's voice cracked. And if he still refuses? Caleb's expression hardened. Then we make him. He doesn't have options. He'll sign. Nora sank onto the edge of the bed, pressing her hands to her face. The echo of her father's calm voice lingered in her mind, tomorrow. With a notary. It wasn't a refusal, but it wasn't surrender either. It was something else, something that unsettled her. While they argued, Walter stepped quietly into the study. He closed the door, drew the curtains, and picked up the old landline phone tucked into the desk drawer. He dialed a number from memory. The line clicked, then a woman's voice answered, Porter Law. This is Ms. Porter. Margaret, Walter said softly, his voice steady. It's Walter Keene. I need you here tomorrow morning. And bring a notary. We'll be making adjustments. There was a pause on the line, then her tone shifted to firm professionalism. Adjustments to what? To everything, Walter replied. He glanced at the closed door, listening for footsteps upstairs. They've made their move. Tomorrow, I make mine. That evening, when Walter returned to the kitchen, Nora and Caleb were already there, sitting stiffly at the table. The papers were gone, tucked back into Caleb's leather portfolio. Walter gave them both a thin smile. Dinner at 7, he said lightly. I'll make something special. We'll talk then. Nora forced a nod. Caleb only stared. As Walter walked past, he felt their eyes burning into his back. But he didn't falter. He had the proof. He had the plan. and tomorrow, he would turn their trap inside out. By 6 o'clock, the house smelled of onions softening in butter, the sweet tang of tomatoes simmering, and the rich undercurrent of beef stew bubbling low on the stove. Walter had chosen the recipe with intent, simple, familiar, something that would remind Nora of her mother's cooking. Nostalgia was bait, and tonight he needed them to relax. He stood at the stove in a clean button-down shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. The kitchen light glowed golden, chasing away the early evening chill. On the sideboard sat 3 bowls, arranged carefully. To anyone watching, it was the image of a father making peace with his family. But hidden in the fold of his cardigan, stitched under the lapel seam, was a tiny blinking red light. A wire. Walter had tested it twice in the basement, whispering into the fabric, hearing his voice playback clean and sharp. Now it sat against his chest, catching every word, every clink of glass, every careless slip of tongue. At exactly 7, Nora and Caleb appeared in the doorway. She wore a pale sweater, her hair tied back. He wore his usual casual bravado, pressed shirt, leather belt, the faint trace of cologne. Both looked tense, though Caleb covered it better. Walter turned from the stove with a faint smile. "You're just in time. Sit." They obeyed, Caleb pulling out a chair with exaggerated politeness, Nora lowering herself as though unsure the chair would hold. Walter ladled stew into each bowl, steam rising in fragrant clouds. "Smells good," Caleb said, forcing a smile. Walter set the last bowl down, then joined them at the table. "Your mother used to say a good meal makes people honest." He dipped his spoon, lifted it to his lips, and sipped. "Let's test that theory." The first few minutes passed with the clatter of spoons, the scrape of bread against bowls. The silence was heavy but not hostile, almost like a truce. Nora glanced at her father now and then, but every time she did, he met her eyes with a calm that made her look away. Finally, Caleb broke the quiet. "Walter, about tomorrow. I've arranged everything. We'll have a notary, and once the signatures are done, you won't have to worry about a single detail again." Walter set his spoon down gently. "Tell me again why this is necessary." Caleb leaned back, voice smooth. "Because you've earned rest. Managing property, paying bills, it's too much. Nora and I can handle it. You just enjoy your time." Walter's gaze shifted to his daughter. "And you agree with this, Nora?" Her lips parted. She hesitated, eyes flicking to Caleb. It's easier, Dad. We don't want you stressed." Walter's voice softened. "Stressed? Or powerless?" The question hung like a knife. Nora dropped her gaze to her bowl. Caleb chuckled, breaking the moment. "You're sharp, Walter. That's why we respect you. But think of it as protection. Families look after each other. That's what we're doing." Walter studied him, then nodded slowly, almost as if conceding. "I see. Protection." The recorder in his cardigan blinked steadily. They ate in silence again until Caleb, unable to help himself, leaned forward, voice dropping. "You know, it's not just about bills. The house, this property, it's worth far more than you realize. We've had people approach us about selling." Nora shot him a sharp glance, but he continued. "With the market the way it is, we could clear a fortune. Enough to start fresh. You wouldn't need to worry about upkeep. You'd still have a place with us, of course." Walter's spoon paused midair. He set it down slowly. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "So that's it. Not protection. Profit." Caleb waved a dismissive hand. "Call it what you like. Everyone benefits." Walter leaned back in his chair. "Except me. I lose the home I built. The one your mother loved. The place where you, Nora, grew up." Nora's face flushed. She stammered, "Dad, it's not like that." Walter cut her off gently. "Then tell me what it's like." Her throat worked, but no words came. The silence stretched. Only the faint bubble of stew on the stove filled it. At last, Walter smiled faintly and rose, collecting his empty bowl. "Thank you for being honest," he said, though the words carried a weight neither missed. Mother was right. Meals do reveal the truth. He rinsed his bowl at the sink, the water running steady, the clink of porcelain masking his next words, spoken low enough for himself, "And tomorrow, the whole world will hear it." Later that night, after Nora and Caleb retreated upstairs, Walter sat alone in the study. He slipped the recorder from his cardigan and set it on the desk. He pressed play. Voices spilled out, Caleb's confident promises, Nora's hesitation, the slip about selling the house. Every word crisp, undeniable. Walter closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of their betrayal, feeling it etch deeper into him. When the playback ended, he placed the device beside the envelopes of camera footage. Together, they formed a pile small enough to fit in a single folder, but heavy enough to crush the lies that had been spun around him. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled, eyes on the dark window where his reflection stared back. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Tomorrow, you'll learn what protection really means." The morning broke with a sharp chill, sunlight slicing across the frosted lawn. Walter had risen before dawn, shaving with steady hands, pressing his shirt until every crease lay flat. He wanted to look precise, deliberate, the way men did before stepping into courtrooms or board meetings. Today was not a casual day. Downstairs, the house smelled of coffee again. Walter brewed it deliberately, letting the scent fill the kitchen so Nora and Caleb would find him calm, ordinary, predictable. He poured his own cup, set 2 mugs on the table for them, then sat in silence, sipping, waiting. At 8:55, Caleb came down first, tie knotted neatly, leather portfolio in hand. His face carried the smug confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "Morning, Walter," he said easily, setting the folder on the table with a deliberate thud. "Ready to make this official?" Walter lifted his cup. "Always good to make things official." Nora followed moments later, pale but dressed carefully, her hair pinned up, her sweater freshly pressed. She avoided her father's eyes, sitting beside Caleb as though needing his shadow to hide in. Caleb slid the papers from the folder, aligning them in a stack. A pen gleamed on top. "Tom will be here any minute. He's the notary. We'll get your signatures, keep it neat." Walter's mouth curved in a faint smile. "Yes, I look forward to meeting Tom." Almost on cue, the doorbell rang. Caleb rose quickly, striding to the door. He opened it with the broad smile of a host. "Tom. Good to see you, come in." But the man on the porch was not Tom. A woman in a tailored navy suit stepped in first, dark briefcase in hand, hair tied in a professional knot. Behind her followed a tall, silver-haired notary with an embossed portfolio, his seal gleaming at the corner. And just behind them, standing at the threshold, was a uniformed welfare officer and Sergeant Lang from the local precinct, his expression neutral but watchful. Caleb's smile faltered. "Who?" "Margaret Porter," the woman said crisply, handing him a card without breaking stride. "Walter's attorney. You must be Mr. Blake." She brushed past him, her heels clicking firmly across the hardwood. The real notary followed, nodding politely, while the officer lingered near the doorway, folding his arms. Nora rose to her feet, eyes wide. "Dad, what is this?" Walter set down his coffee cup and stood, steady, composed. "This," he said softly, "is what proper looks like." Caleb's jaw clenched, but he forced a laugh. "Walter, this isn't necessary. We already arranged." Margaret cut him off, her voice smooth as glass. "Any arrangement made without legal oversight would be void. Today, we'll ensure everything is handled properly. With witnesses." She placed her briefcase on the table, snapping it open with a sharp click. Inside lay a neatly organized stack of folders, each tabbed, each labeled. She pulled out the top one and laid it flat. Walter's gaze flicked to his daughter. "Sit, Nora." Her knees seemed to buckle as she lowered herself back into the chair. Caleb remained standing, jaw tight, hands gripping the backrest. The notary opened his portfolio, sliding out the seal and ink pad. "Shall we begin?" Margaret's tone turned formal. "First, we'll review the current documents you've prepared." She extended a hand to Caleb. "May I see them?" He hesitated, then, under Sergeant Lang's watchful eye, slid the papers across. Margaret scanned them swiftly, her brows arching at the bold titles. Power of attorney. Title transfer. Beneficiary amendment. She looked up, her eyes sharp. "Quite thorough for something you claimed was just protection." Walter's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Margaret set the papers aside, then pulled her own documents from the briefcase. "Walter has already signed updated directives. Last night. I witnessed them myself." Caleb's head snapped up. "What?" Margaret's voice remained steady. "An irrevocable trust, effective immediately. The property, assets, and accounts have been secured. They cannot be altered or sold without strict conditions. Beneficiary designations have been adjusted accordingly." Nora gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Caleb's face darkened. "You can't just." "The documents have already been filed," Margaret said sharply. "This meeting is merely for transparency. And for the record." Walter stepped forward then, his presence commanding. "You wanted a signature, Caleb. You'll get one. But not the one you expected." The notary stamped the trust documents with a firm press of the seal. The sound echoed in the tense silence. Caleb slammed a hand against the table. "This is manipulation. He's confused, he doesn't know what he's doing." Margaret's gaze was icy. "Confused? He contacted me personally. He reviewed every clause." And she reached into her briefcase again, pulling out a small black recorder. "He provided recordings. Conversations from this house. Conversations where you admitted your intent to force him." Nora's breath caught. Her eyes darted to her father's face, searching. He didn't look at her. Margaret pressed a button. The device crackled, then Caleb's own voice filled the room. "With the market the way it is, we could clear a fortune. Enough to start fresh. You wouldn't need to worry about upkeep. You'd still have a place with us, of course." Caleb's face drained of color. Sergeant Lang stepped forward, arms still folded. "I'd be careful with what you say next, Mr. Blake." The room was silent but for the faint hiss of the stove where water simmered. Finally, Walter spoke, his voice low but steady. "You locked me out, Caleb. You laughed, Nora. You thought cold and humiliation would break me. Instead, you gave me proof. Proof that the two of you weren't protecting me. You were circling like vultures." Nora's eyes brimmed with tears. "Dad." But Walter raised a hand. "Don't. Tomorrow, you'll have your choice. But today, you'll sit here and watch as every lie unravels." He lowered himself back into his chair, folding his hands. "Come again." The man they had underestimated had set the trap, and now the jaws were closing. The room felt like it had been stripped of air. Caleb stood rigid, veins rising at his temple, while Nora sat small in her chair, hands trembling in her lap. On the table, Margaret Porter spread out Walter's new papers with the precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. Each page was a nail, each signature a coffin lid. Walter remained seated at the head of the table, posture straight, his palms resting lightly on the wood. He looked like a man who had waited years for this moment and now needed only to watch it unfold. Margaret adjusted her glasses and spoke with deliberate clarity. "Mr. Keene has executed an irrevocable trust. As of last night, the house, his accounts, and all tied assets have been placed under legal protection. He is the primary trustee. This means—" Caleb cut her off, his voice sharp, almost cracking. "This means nothing. He's being manipulated. He doesn't understand." Sergeant Lang, still by the door, spoke for the first time. "Careful, son. I'm only here as a witness today, but I'll remind you, intimidation of a senior citizen can carry legal consequences. And from what I've just heard on that recording, his eyes locked on Caleb's. You're already in dangerous waters. Caleb swallowed hard, fists clenching. He forced himself into a laugh that rang hollow. You're blowing this out of proportion. Families argue. They say things. That doesn't mean he knows what he's signing. Margaret ignored him, sliding the top document toward Walter. Here is the statement of intent, reaffirmed in my presence and notarized. Walter, would you confirm to everyone what you decided? Walter nodded once, his eyes never leaving his daughter. I decided that what I built, what your mother and I sacrificed for, will not be gambled away for greed. He lifted the page, tapped it gently. This trust cannot be undone. Not by Nora. Not by Caleb. Not by anyone. The notary dipped his pen in ink, pressing the seal again. The heavy stamp rang like a judge's gavel. Nora gasped. Irrevocable? Her voice cracked, brittle as glass. Walter's gaze softened for just a moment. Yes, Nora. Irrevocable. I gave you everything as a child, my time, my work, my love. And last night, when you left me in the cold, you gave me the answer to a question I hadn't dared ask, whether you would protect me, or destroy me. Tears pricked her eyes. I didn't, Dad, I didn't mean. You meant every laugh. Walter cut her off quietly, his tone like steel under velvet. You meant every lock on that door. And you meant it when you stood by while Caleb tried to strip me of my home. Caleb's mask cracked. This is ridiculous. You can't cut Nora out of everything. She's your daughter. Blood means something. Walter's eyes snapped to him, cold as winter stone. Blood means nothing without loyalty. Margaret slid the final packet forward, her voice crisp. For the record, the trust assigns Walter as trustee until death. Upon his passing, the property and assets will pass not to his daughter, but to, she tapped the page. The next named beneficiary. Caleb leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. And who's that? Walter's gaze never wavered. He folded his hands and spoke evenly. To Nora's unborn child. The room froze. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Her hand flew to her stomach instinctively, though the pregnancy was still early, barely known outside the two of them. Dad, her voice broke, torn between shock and shame. Walter continued, relentless but calm. You may have chosen betrayal, Nora. But I will not punish your child for your weakness. Everything I have will be secured for the next generation, the one who hasn't yet had the chance to prove loyalty or dishonor. Caleb's face drained of color. You can't. Oh, but he can, Margaret interrupted sharply. The trust is filed. The court will uphold it. Upon Walter's passing, the inheritance will bypass both of you. Caleb, you will have no claim, no leverage, no control. Nora, she glanced at the young woman, whose eyes brimmed with tears. You will only have access if you separate your finances and fulfill the stipulations Walter has outlined. Nora turned to her father, voice trembling. What stipulations? Walter's eyes softened but did not yield. Counseling. Proof that you can stand apart from Caleb. And restitution, supervised service to others, so you learn that cruelty carries weight. Only then will you be trusted to safeguard anything for the child you carry. Caleb exploded, slamming both palms onto the table. This is madness. You've let this lawyer poison you. You'd hand everything to a child not even born yet instead of your own daughter? Walter rose slowly, his height and presence filling the room. He leaned forward, voice low, every word deliberate. Better to trust innocence not yet stained than to trust greed proven in the flesh. Caleb's mouth opened, but no words came. His face twisted with rage, but under Sergeant Lang's steady gaze, he dared not take a step further. Nora crumpled in her chair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Her father's decision felt like a knife, but beneath the pain, some small part of her recognized the truth of his words. The notary pressed the final seal, the heavy thunk echoing like a closing vault. Margaret slid the finished folder back into her case. Walter adjusted his sweater, turned his back on them both, and spoke as he walked toward the window. "You wanted signatures," he said quietly. "Now you have them. Just not the ones you expected." The documents lay sealed and signed, a neat stack that glowed with finality under the weak morning light. Margaret Porter closed her briefcase with a snap, the sound sharp as a gavel. Caleb hadn't sat back down. He hovered near the table, jaw clenched, fists opening and closing as though looking for something to crush. Nora remained slumped in her chair, eyes red, her hands trembling over her lap. Walter stood by the window, his back to them, gazing out at the frost melting across the lawn. For a long moment, the silence pressed in. Then he turned, his face calm, his eyes harder than stone. "We're not finished." Margaret glanced at him, then stepped aside as if she already knew what was coming. Sergeant Lang shifted against the wall, arms folded, watching closely. Walter moved toward the table, his steps slow, deliberate. He opened a small wooden box he had carried in from the basement earlier, the kind that once held silverware but now contained something far heavier, his truth. From it, he drew a portable screen and a handful of small envelopes. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" Walter placed the envelopes in a neat row on the table. Each was dated in his careful block letters. "Memories," he said simply. "Things the house remembers when people think it's empty." Nora's throat worked as she swallowed. Something in her father's tone chilled her more than the frost outside. Walter slid an SD card into the screen, powered it on, and turned it so the table could see. The footage flickered alive, the living room, time-stamped 2 nights ago. Walter in his recliner, paper open. Nora standing at the counter, lifting his keys, slipping them into her pocket. Caleb blocking the view, his voice booming about wine. Nora gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her shoulders shook as if she'd been struck. Walter let the clip play in silence. Then he removed the card and slid in another. This one showed the entryway. Walter pounding on the door, voice muffled but desperate. On the other side, Nora leaning against the wall, smirking at the peephole. Caleb's figure passed behind her. The chain clicked into place. Her laugh, sharp, cruel, cut through the room like a blade. The silence after the clip ended was unbearable. Nora's sob broke it, small and choking. "Dad. But Walter wasn't finished. He pulled a third card, pressed play. The kitchen, late that night. Caleb's voice, low and confident, "Cold will teach him. Tomorrow he'll sign, one way or another." Caleb lunged toward the table. "Turn that off." Sergeant Lang stepped forward instantly, hand raised. "Sit down." His tone left no room for argument. Caleb froze, seething, then dropped back into the chair with a curse under his breath. Walter reached into his cardigan, pulled out the small black recorder, and placed it on the table. He pressed play. The device crackled, then Caleb's own voice filled the air again, "Recorded over dinner, with the market the way it is, we could clear a fortune. Enough to start fresh. You wouldn't need to worry about upkeep. You'd still have a place with us, of course." Every word hung heavy in the air. Nora sobbed openly now, her face buried in her hands. Caleb's eyes darted to the officer, then to Margaret, then finally to Walter, rage boiling beneath his skin. Walter, however, remained perfectly still. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "You thought humiliation would break me. You thought leaving me in the cold would make me crawl, beg, surrender. But instead, you gave me evidence. Your laughter, Nora. Your greed, Caleb. You gave me everything I needed to protect what's mine." He turned off the recorder, slid it back into his pocket, and walked to the doorway that led to the porch. He pushed it open, letting the crisp air flood in. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the boards where his fists had pounded, where his breath had fogged, where his daughter had listened without pity. Then he turned back to them, voice cutting through the morning. "This is where I stood, shivering, waiting for mercy from my own child. And this," he gestured to the footage frozen on the screen, "is what the world will see if you deny what you did." Every word, every laugh, every plan. You've left me no choice but to remember. Caleb surged to his feet again, face twisted. You're ruining everything. Do you understand that? You think you've won, old man, but... Enough. Lang's voice cut across his. He stepped forward, one hand resting deliberately on his duty belt. Mr. Blake, you're lucky this is still a family matter. But if you make one more threat, I'll stop treating it that way. Caleb froze, chest heaving. Walter's eyes moved back to his daughter. For a moment, his face softened, but his voice did not. Nora, look at me. She raised her tear-streaked face, shame etched deep. You left me to freeze. You laughed when I begged. That cannot be undone. But I will not erase you entirely. The trust protects your child, not you. If you want to rebuild, you'll have to do it on your own terms, without him. He flicked his eyes toward Caleb. Without cruelty. Nora sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking violently. Caleb muttered a curse under his breath. Walter stepped back into the kitchen, closed the porch door behind him, and let the silence stretch again. The air was heavy, final, every truth laid bare. Margaret cleared her throat, gathering the papers. Everything has been documented. Officer, I believe you've heard enough to understand the situation. Lang nodded. Plenty. His gaze lingered on Caleb. And I'll be making a note of it. Walter exhaled slowly, then lowered himself into his chair again. He folded his hands neatly, like a man who had just finished carving his enemy's name into stone. For years, he said softly, I thought my greatest fear was losing what I built. But now I see, my greatest mistake was believing loyalty was inherited. It isn't. It's earned. And you 2-inch, he looked at Caleb, then at Nora, have taught me that the hard way. The table was silent but for Nora's soft sobs. Caleb stared at the floor, jaw tight, his hands clenched so hard his knuckles whitened. Walter sat back, the faintest trace of exhaustion showing in his eyes, but his voice remained strong. Now, the lesson is yours. The footage ended, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Nora's stifled sobs. Caleb sat frozen, fists pressed against his knees, his jaw working furiously but no words escaping. The briefcase on the table gleamed under the light, filled not with his victory, but with the legal seals that had just sealed his defeat. Margaret Porter gathered her folders, her calm professionalism like a blade. The terms of the trust are not open to debate, she said crisply. Mr. Keene has the right to decide the fate of his estate. That right has been secured, documented, and witnessed. She closed the case with a heavy snap. Which means, Mr. Blake, your role in this matter is finished. Caleb finally found his voice, hoarse with rage. You can't just erase me. I'm family now. Nora and I are married, her inheritance is mine too. Walter leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes dark and sharp. No, Caleb. Nothing will ever be yours. Not this house, not my name, not the sweat that built it. Marriage doesn't make a thief into family. Caleb shoved back his chair, half rising. Sergeant Lang's quiet cough stopped him mid-motion. The officer's hand rested on his belt again, a silent warning. Caleb sank back down, teeth grinding. Walter turned then to his daughter. Nora. Her head jerked up, eyes swollen, cheeks streaked with tears. She looked so small suddenly, nothing like the confident young woman who had once stood in this same kitchen demanding control. Dad, she whispered. Walter studied her for a long, aching moment. His voice, when it came, was steady but heavy with years. You are my daughter. That can't be undone. But you betrayed me. She shook her head, trembling. I didn't think it would go this far. Caleb said. Walter raised a hand, silencing her. You laughed, Nora. You locked me out. You listened to me beg, and you laughed. Her breath caught, and fresh tears slid down her face. Walter's gaze softened, just barely. But blood still matters. Which is why I haven't erased you completely. Nora blinked, confused. What do you mean? Margaret opened the folder again and slid one paper across the table. The irrevocable trust, she explained, names the unborn child as the direct beneficiary. Not you. Not Caleb. The estate bypasses you entirely. Nora's hand flew to her stomach, her lips parting in shock. The baby. Yes, Margaret confirmed. The inheritance is secured for the next generation. Upon Walter's passing, everything goes into a locked fund for the child until adulthood. Nora's voice cracked. But I'll still. Margaret's tone softened slightly. There are stipulations. If you wish to serve as guardian of those assets until the child is of age, you'll have to fulfill them. Counseling. Proof of separation from Mr. Blake. Documented service, community work, restitution. Only then will the court allow you to oversee anything on behalf of your child. Nora's mouth trembled. And if I don't? Walter answered for her. Then the court will appoint someone else. Your child will still be protected. You'll have nothing. The weight of his words crushed her. She sank deeper into her chair, sobs shaking her shoulders. Dad, please. I made a mistake. Walter's voice trembled now, though his words were still firm. A mistake is forgetting an appointment. A mistake is burning dinner. You tried to strip me of my dignity. You left me to suffer. You don't erase that with an apology. Her eyes begged him, desperate for a softness that no longer lived in him. Across the table, Caleb finally snapped, his voice a hiss. Don't listen to this. He's manipulating you, Nora. He's cutting us out. Walter's eyes burned into him. Us? There is no us. You used her. Twisted her. You wanted the house, the money, the power. But you never cared about her, not really. Caleb's face reddened, his jaw locking. But in that silence, even Nora seemed to realize the truth. The way Caleb's hands tightened only when his own security was threatened. The way his words always circled back to control. Her sobbing quieted. She looked at him, not with fear, not with loyalty, but with dawning clarity. Walter's voice lowered, almost tender now, though still edged with pain. Nora. I won't leave you destitute. The trust ensures you'll have a roof over your head while you decide who you want to be. But you'll never touch my estate, not unless you change. Your child deserves better than what you've become. The words cut deeper than any shouted condemnation. For a moment, Nora couldn't breathe. She pressed both hands to her face, shoulders curling inward, her whole body shaking. Caleb muttered, "This is insane." Margaret's voice snapped like a whip. Mr. Blake, you should be grateful charges aren't already filed. The evidence presented today would easily support prosecution for coercion and elder abuse. You may want to leave before I advise otherwise. Caleb's eyes darted around the room, searching for control he no longer had. But every face, the lawyer's stern, the officer's watchful, Walter's unyielding, told him the same thing. He had lost. For the first time, his voice faltered. This isn't over. Sergeant Lang stepped forward. Yes, it is. Walter rose from his chair. His frame wasn't large, but the weight of his presence filled the kitchen. He looked down at Caleb with eyes that no longer saw him as a threat. Only as a warning. You took my keys, Caleb, Walter said quietly. But you forgot, the house was always mine. Caleb flinched at the words. For a moment, the arrogance drained from him completely. Nora buried her face in her hands. Walter turned away, the matter finished in his mind. He walked to the living room window, staring out at the yard where frost still clung to the grass, sunlight breaking it apart in glittering shards. The inheritance was secured. The betrayal answered. But the cost, the ache in his chest as he listened to his daughter cry, would linger far longer than any signature. The room emptied of arguments first, then of people. Margaret Porter closed her briefcase, gave Walter a small, respectful nod, and stepped out with the notary at her shoulder, their shoes crisp on the front walk. The welfare officer lingered to hand Nora a pamphlet, shelter lines, counseling numbers, legal aid, then slipped away quietly. Only Sergeant Lang remained, broad-shouldered and patient, the still center of a storm that had spent itself. Caleb wasn't done. He circled the table once, twice, feral heat simmering under his skin. His eyes kept finding the stack of envelopes and the little screen like a predator sending raw meat. "You set me up," he hissed at Walter. "You think a few papers will fix your life?" Walter didn't rise. "No. The papers fixed the part of it you tried to break." Caleb's gaze flicked to Nora, red-eyed, small, folded into herself. "No rescue there." He lunged toward the table, fingers stabbing for the envelopes. Lang moved like a door closing. One hand caught Caleb's wrist, the other turned him by the elbow. The motion was clean, practiced, almost gentle until Caleb tried to tear free. "Don't," Lang warned, voice low. "Tampering with evidence, intimidation, do you really want more charges?" Caleb spat a curse that collapsed into breathlessness as the cuffs bit. The sound of metal wasn't loud, but it carried. In the dining room's quiet, it sounded like an ending finally catching up. Nora flinched. "Caleb, don't fight. Just stop." Her voice cracked on the last word, as if the syllable itself weighed too much. He stared at her, something like calculation flickering and dying behind his eyes. Whatever he'd come to take, it had slid permanently out of reach. He dropped his gaze to the floor as Lang guided him toward the hall. At the threshold Caleb twisted once more, seeking Walter's face. "You'll regret this." Walter lifted a brow, almost weary. "I regretted you the minute I watched you teach my daughter to laugh at the cold." There was no reply left. The front door opened. Morning air swept in, bright and unsparing. Lang guided Caleb across the porch and down the steps. A cruiser engine idled at the curb, its exhaust turning to pale ghost breath that faded as quickly as it formed. The door shut on Caleb's muttered fury, and the street swallowed him. For a long moment the house just breathed. The heater clicked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, a tap ticked once and fell silent. Walter rose. Years showed in the movement, but not defeat. He gathered the envelopes, slid them into the wooden box, and closed the lid. The recorder went in too. He stood with the box in his hands, feeling its weight, then carried it to the study. Cutaway, in the dimness of the study, he knelt by the lower drawer he'd hollowed out when the world still felt dependable. He eased the box inside, laid a folded towel over it, and closed the drawer with a soft push. On the desk he left a yellow sticky note addressed to himself, "Bank, 10 a.m., safe deposit," underlined twice. Not for vengeance. For memory, if memory ever needed witnesses again. When he came back to the hallway, Nora was on her feet but uncertain, as if learning how to stand in a new gravity. The pamphlet hung limp in one hand. Her mouth opened, no word arrived. Shame sat on her like a coat she hadn't noticed putting on until the weight of it made her stoop. "Dad," her voice was a thread. Walter shook his head, once, slow. Not punishment, not absolution. A boundary drawn with steady chalk. He walked to the foyer table. The surface was clean, the little bowl for keys waited, empty. He took a plain white card from the drawer, uncapped a pen, and wrote a single line. He set the card beside the bowl where morning light could find it. "Come back when you're ready to choose better." He straightened the card by habit, the way he had straightened picture frames and invoices and the soft, sloping handwriting his wife used to leave on the fridge. Then he turned to the alarm panel and pressed a key sequence. A red diode tucked high in the crown molding, one of the smoke detectors that wasn't, flickered twice and went dark. He walked room to room, up the stairs and down, and did the same to each silent eye. Not erasing proof, retiring sentries. He had protected what needed protecting. The house could have its privacy back. From the porch, the day had sharpened into a pale blue honesty. Nora stepped outside as if drawn by a current, the pamphlet still scrunched in her hand. She lowered herself to the top step and hugged her elbows against a wind that wasn't cruel now so much as clear. Her eyes settled on the grain of the wood where the frost had outlined 2 faint footprints at dawn. There, just there, the boards still held a darker memory, as if the season had burned it in. Walter paused on the threshold, looking down at the same spot. His breath left him in a measured cloud. For a second his face moved with something like grief, the old kind, the kind that doesn't excuse and doesn't condemn, only marks the distance between how things were meant to be and how they have become. He put a hand to the door. It swung inward on hinges he had oiled every spring. He did not say goodbye. He did not say come in. He didn't trust either word to carry what he needed them to carry. Behind him the foyer was neat, quiet, held together by the stubborn dignity of wood and habit. Ahead of him the porch shone with washed light. He stepped back into the house and, with deliberate care, left the door ajar. Nora watched him as if waiting for the latch to click. When it didn't, her shoulders shook once, a soundless sob swallowed by the morning. From the sidewalk, Mrs. Alvarez slowed, taking in the cruiser 2 doors down, the way Walter stood in his doorway, not guarding, not inviting, simply present. She lifted a hand. Walter answered it with a tired smile. Neighbors would talk. That, too, was part of the cost. Sergeant Lang returned a few minutes later to hand Walter a card at the threshold, case number, his signature. "We'll be in touch," he said. His gaze flicked to Nora on the step, then to the space between door and jamb. He seemed to understand. "Good luck, Mr. Keene." "Luck's for people who can't build," Walter said mildly. "I'll settle for routine." Lang nodded and left. The house exhaled again. In the kitchen, Walter rinsed 2 mugs and set one, Nora's favorite blue, on the rack. He stood there with his hands on the edge of the sink, knuckles white, until the tremor in his fingers passed. Then he brewed tea the way he always had, kettle to flame, tin to table, sugar bowl centered. He didn't reach for the recorder. The porcelain lid rattled, but only because porcelain lids rattle. He carried a mug to the foyer and placed it on the table beside the note. Steam curled into the entryway light, ordinary as breath. He looked once more at the door held slightly open by nothing more than its own will to balance. On the step, Nora lifted her head. She wasn't ready to cross the threshold. Not yet. Choices do not reverse themselves in an hour. But she read the card from where she sat and folded the pamphlet smaller, edges aligning under new, careful fingers. Walter turned and walked toward the back of the house. In the workshop, he brushed his thumb along the vise where walnuts still waited to become a frame. He measured the wood with his eye, then with the small metal rule, making a mark where a corner would meet another corner cleanly if given care. Outside, a gust moved through the hydrangeas that hid the crawlspace hatch. Leaves lifted and settled, as if the house itself were tucking away last night's secret. Down the hall, the thermostat clicked. Somewhere in the living room, a floorboard gave a familiar complaint he could name by sound alone. He let the quiet collect and hold. Revenge, he realized, hadn't been the point, not truly. Protection had. And something slower, harder, worth more, the chance, slim, stubborn, for a better choice. At the front of the house the open door stood like a lesson. The latch was unlatched, the chain unhooked, the cold coming in only as far as it was allowed. The red camera light above slept, a small mercy. The note lay white and plain. "Come back when you're ready to choose better." Walter wiped a speck of sawdust from the mark he'd made and, for the first time since the night began, let his shoulders drop. The plan had cost him, as all good plans do. But cost is how you tell if something is worth having. He set the rule down, turned off the basement light, and climbed the stairs slow enough to hear each tread answer him. In the foyer he passed the open door without touching it. He didn't need to. Some doors you close to end a thing. Some you leave unlocked so the ending can become a beginning, if someone decides they want one. On the porch, Nora shivered, then drew a longer, steadier breath. She slid the pamphlet into her pocket and looked at the space between door and frame. The distance wasn't much. It felt like a mile. She stood and took a single step closer, not crossing, not retreating, standing where the cold was real and the warmth could be real, too, if earned. Inside, the house held its line. The door stayed open. The cameras slept. And Walter, who had once begged to be let in, walked to his table, set 2 cups, and waited, not for forgiveness, but for the sound of a hand choosing to turn a handle.